Welcoming you today to the talk by Erika Podest. Erika, for those of you that don't know her, she's a research scientist here, and her expertise is in sort of bringing remote sensing to terrestrial ecosystem research. She's actually spent a lot of her professional career here. She did her bachelor's degree in electrical engineering in a college in Arizona, but since then she attended her master's degree and her PhD. She did that through the University of Dundee in Scotland, but she actually spent a fair bit of time here. Kyle MacDonald served as sort of one of her co-advisors through her PhD degree, so she's been here since through some parts of 2001 since then, and then got her PhD in 2005. We hired her as a postdoc from 2005, and then in 2009 she was hired as a research scientist. And we've been happy to have her since. She's played a key role in sort of the development of the SMAP program within her research. She's also was a successful selection for a new investigator award about 2 years ago. And so today she's going to talk to us about her experience at the COP17 meeting. Being in the limelight's not too foreign to her. She's also been featured in LA's weekly Best People annual edition. Best People, and also in Latino TV in the Latin Heroes edition. Erika hails from Panama, by the way. So I'll give a little bit of an anecdote of how this came about. In October, Jack wrote the science leads from the labs and said that NASA is taking, 4 scientists to this 2-week meeting. And he had already pegged 3 people, himself and 2 others, and he was looking for 1 more. And he just made a non-qualified statement about diversity. And anyway, without thinking too much about that, the challenge was it was occurring during AGU week. I had to figure out someone that would be useful and know something about that and contribute. And in a fairly short order, within a few minutes, Erika's name came to me, and I thought that could work out really well. And she wasn't going to AGU, or at least was willing to sacrifice it. Sent me her CV, and within a couple hours, we sent it to Jack, and he responded and said, "This looks good, let me get back to you." And then within about a day later, he said, "Yes, this looks great." And the diversity is great to have a woman scientist born in Panama, educated in Scotland. It just worked really well for him. So with that, I'm going to let Erika take it away and tell us about her experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Dwayne, for that great introduction. And thank you to all of you for being here. So today I'll give you a first-hand account about my participation at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Conference of Party, also known as COP17, which took place in Durban, South Africa. So as Dwayne mentioned, this was a 2-week conference. It went from November 29th through December 9th. And I was part of the US component, of the NASA component of the US delegation. So the NASA component was formed by 5 people. There was 1 technical person, and there were 4 scientists. The technical person was Eric Sokolowski. He's from Goddard. And the scientists were Jack Kay. He's the Associate Research Director for the Earth Science Division at headquarters. Dan Irwin, who's the project manager for Surveyor. He's at Marshall. And Pierre Sellers, who's ex-astronaut and now Deputy Director of the Earth and Science and Exploration Directorate at Goddard Space Flight Center. And then there was me. Okay, so I was quite honored to be part of such a distinguished group of scientists. All right, so I was there for just 1 week. As I mentioned, the conference was 2 weeks. Piers and Dan, they were there for the first week only, and Jack and I were there for just the second week. And then Eric, the technical person, was there for the entire time. So before I get into my experiences and sharing with you what I learned, I thought it'd be useful for you to know a little bit about the background of the UNFCCC. So the UNFCCC was a result of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And the Rio Earth Summit was actually huge. It was quite historic, I would say, because it was the first international Earth Summit, and over 100 heads of states were represented there. There were a lot of great results that came out of the Earth Summit. And for those of you that might recall this time, before Kyoto was in everyone's mouth, it was Rio. And people get talking about Rio and what came out of that for years. So there were 4 things that came out of Rio. One was the Rio Declaration on the Environment and Development. Then there was a Statement of Principles of Forests. Then there was a Convention on Biodiversity and the Convention on Climate Change, which is the UNFCCC. So the objective of the UNFCCC was to stabilize greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the Earth's climate system. And the first UNFCCC was held in 1995. So all of the members that were part of this treaty, they're known as parties. And 1995 marked the first Convention of Parties. And the UNFCCC has been meeting on an annual basis. So the meeting in Durban was the 17th Convention of Parties. A few things about the UNFCCC. It has no mandatory greenhouse gas emission limits. It has no enforcement. It's non-binding. However, the treaty does provide for updates, also known as protocols, that set mandatory emission levels. And the principal update is the Kyoto Protocol. So basically, the Kyoto Protocol has become synonymous with the UNFCCC. But the Kyoto Protocol was formed in 1997, and it was a way to set mandatory emission limits and binding agreements. Of course, countries that did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol have no binding agreements. And there are 4 countries that never ratified the protocol, and 1 that recently withdrew. So the Kyoto Protocol entered into force in February 2005, and it expires this year. And that was one of the big issues coming into this conference was, well, Kyoto is expiring 2012. What are we going to do? Are we going to scrap it? Are we going to continue it? That was a big debate. So I'll give you a little bit of a sense of how this conference was structured. It's a huge conference, first of all. There were about 15,000 people. And it's not a conference that you go and you register online. You have to be accredited to attend. And the way you're accredited is you basically are nominated by either a government or an organization that is already registered and accredited by the UNFCCC. So there were the big negotiating halls, and this was kind of the main part of the conference were the negotiations. And there were many different negotiating halls because there were many different things being negotiated throughout the 2-week period. And this is an example of the largest negotiating hall. And this is where it all happened. So this is where the opening ceremony took place, and this is where the closing ceremony took place. It's called the Baobab Negotiating Hall. Then there was the exhibition hall. And it was a huge hall with over 100 booths representing NGOs, government organizations, academia, countries, and there were a wide spectrum of just representations there, anywhere from the World Bank to Brown University to 360.org and Greenpeace. So it was really quite an interesting diversity. And then there were the pavilions, and this is just kind of a larger scale display where countries really show their presence at this conference. And these are examples of some of the pavilions that were set up. This is the Indonesian pavilion. This is the EU pavilion. This is the Chinese pavilion. And this is the US pavilion. Now, in terms of the US presence at COP17, there were basically 2 parts to the US presence. One was the negotiating team, and the other one was the US Center. So my responsibility was to support the US Center. The negotiating team, the head of that was Todd Stern, and you probably recognize his face because he was on the news quite often. I think people were very interested to see what the stance of the United States was. And in terms of the US Center, the whole idea of having a US Center was for it to be kind of a public diplomacy effort and for the US to inform the world about what it's doing with regards to combating climate change, not only at home, but abroad as well. So the US Center was set up. It was a small room. There were about 60 seats in the room, and it had the NASA Hyperwall in the back here. You can appreciate the NASA Hyperwall, which is just a series of video screens. These were 15 video screens, 5 horizontal and 3 vertical, which made for just an amazing display of NASA satellite products. So I think the Hyperwall was really a highlight, and it provided the wow factor, I would say. I walked across the whole conference looking at other pavilions, other country pavilions, and none of them had such a wow factor as the U.S. Center had. So the way the U.S. Center was structured is that it had a number of different panel discussions. Each panel discussion was an hour and a half long, and each discussion was comprised of either 4 or 5 panelists. And there were a number of different topics discussed from a number of different U.S. agencies, including USAID, DOD, EPA, WHO, NIH, DOE, NOAA, NASA, DOC, Department of Commerce. So it was quite interesting just to hear everything discussed, everything the U.S. is doing, again, not only in the U.S. but abroad in terms of combating climate change. And NASA was also part of a panel discussion. The title of that discussion was Viewing the Earth's Climate from Space. And the panelists for that were Jack Kay, Jeff Privet from NOAA, Jan Kerr, he's from CESBIO, France, and me. And the focus was on featuring what we can do with satellite products. So Jack Kay talked about NASA's current and future satellite capability for monitoring Earth processes. Jeff Privet talked about NOAA's operational satellite capability. I talked about the water cycle and how we observe it and monitor it using different satellites and how we're looking at the different components of the water cycle. And then Jan Kerr talked about the European satellite capability. So the talk came over really well, and we had a lot of questions and a lot of enthusiasm from the audience. And by the way, all of these panel discussions were streamed live. So people from all over the world could just log into the US State Department website and listen to the talks and send their questions. So usually at the end of each panel discussion, there were a series of questions, not only from people in the room, but from people overseas as well. I think the State Department did a great job in setting this up and in really trying to reach out to a wide audience and informing them what the U.S. is doing. So in between panel discussions, there were 30-minute breaks. And during these 30-minute breaks, we would project NASA Hyperwall presentations. These presentations were put together by the folks at Goddard. And they ranged in topics anywhere from the water cycle to aerosols to ENSO, human fingerprints, glaciers. So another responsibility for me was to be a docent to the Hyperwall, which meant that I would get up there, either Jack Kay or I, we would get up there during these 30-minute intervals, and we'd explain to the audience what they were seeing. And this came over very well. I think that the NASA Hyperwall really gave NASA a dominating presence at COP, and one that NASA hasn't had at any other COP. So I'll talk about a number of issues that were discussed at the U.S. Center, and that's where I spent most of my time. I'll first talk about kind of the social, economic, governance issues, and then I'll talk more about issues related to earth science. So I'll start out with some issues that were actually totally new to me, and issues that we aren't exposed really because we just have such a different lifestyle here in the Western world. But one of them was the role of women in climate change. And this discussion was about how women can, the potential of women in combating climate change. And this was a pretty high-level discussion. The panel was comprised of some very distinguished ladies. This lady right here, Mary Robinson, is former president of Ireland. This lady right here, she's the U.S. Governor-at-Large for women's issues. This lady right here is the foreign minister for, the Minister for Foreign Relations for Mexico. And these two ladies over here are just very distinguished women within the African continent. So they talked about all of these issues regarding women, because women, especially in developing countries, tend to kind of stay in one place. They tend to be more connected with the land. They tend to have sustainable agriculture, gather wood from the forest so that they can cook. So their connection to the land and to the environment is very close. And the focus of the discussion was how to channel money that's going into developing countries so that they can target especially women, since the whole premise is that women might have a stronger impact in combating climate change. So this is a picture that I just had to put in there showing women in Africa gathering wood. All right, another big word is poverty. Poverty has many, many different dimensions, and it's always just kind of thrown around, but in the context of the environment, poverty is actually a significant cause of environmental degradation. And the reason for this is that many people live off the forest and cut the forest for agriculture, for grazing, and to gather wood so that they can cook, to build homes. And it's very difficult to just go up to these people and tell them, listen, stop what you're doing, because this is their livelihood, right? So it's a matter of life or death for them. And there's really no simple solution to this. Climate change refugees was another new concept for me. This is quite interesting, I found. Climate change refugees are people that have been displaced from their homeland because they have lost their home due to flood, drought, famine, sea level rise, and climate-related issues are the biggest underlying cause of refugees, more than those displaced by war and political repression combined. So climate change refugees are not recognized by international law, as opposed to political refugees, where they can seek asylum in countries. Climate change refugees cannot do that. So this is a big issue, and it's being discussed at very high levels. Governance, sustainability in cities. This panel discussion up here had representatives from the national, state, and city governments, and they discussed best practices for promoting energy efficiency and clean and renewable energy in different cities and in different parts of the world, and what has worked and what hasn't worked. And one of the ladies here in the panel, her name is Mary Nichols. She's right here. She's a chairman for the California Air Resources Board. And she was asked a question on how she's involving the local city and academia to combat climate change. And her answer was, she gave the example of a partnership that has been formed between USC, UCLA, JPL, and the LA Mayor's City to basically monitor this corridor in a very poor part of LA. So I thought that was great that she mentioned JPL in her discussion. And then what you see here, this is actually a display outside of the conference, but this is a rooftop garden. And this display was hosted by an architectural firm. So what this firm is doing is it's working with local communities to not only make people aware of green spaces, but make people aware of the environment and having a clean neighborhood. And they've actually been quite successful. If you walk around the neighborhood, you can see that the neighborhood is very clean, and people get incentives for establishing green gardens in their rooftop and for recycling their trash. So they're very motivated to keep their space clean. Now, in terms of environmental science, here's where we get into issues where JPL and NASA's expertise can help. One of the talks at the U.S. Center was from Rear Admiral Titley. He's with the U.S. Navy, and he's in charge of the Climate Change Task Force, amongst his many duties. But he gave a really, really good talk about the interest of the military in climate change, which are mainly for reasons of national security and military readiness. So the 3 points that he really got across was that the military is interested in knowing projections of sea level rise because it might affect military infrastructure. I mean, there are millions of dollars of military infrastructure along coastlines which might be affected by sea level rise. and especially Navy bases. The opening of the Arctic, that's a huge one. It's a whole new ocean, not only for commercial routes, but suddenly you have neighbors that before were separated by a chunk of ice. Now it's an open ocean. So there are many issues and implications with the opening of the Arctic. And then finally, the last issue that he stressed on were issues of instability related to food production, famine, and population displacement. So the concern here is that the U.S. wants to be able to foresee which areas of the world are more susceptible to instability due to famine and displacement and drought in food production. Protecting forests for their value. This was a very strong topic for us. I would say that the forest group really had a loud presence and a very strong presence at the conference. And there were a number of different events organized around protecting forests. And the idea is that maintaining and supporting the recovery of forests is an effective means for combating climate change. So there were a couple of events in support of this. The picture up here, this is Forest Day 5. This is actually a side event. It's a one-day side event. It's the biggest side event during the 2-week conference. And the focus of that side event was to bring people from different parts of the world and discuss what the issues and pressures of forests around the world are, and try to bring solutions to these issues. One person that was particularly remembered in Forest Day was Wangari Maathai. You might know of her, but she was a 2004 Nobel Peace Prize winner. She was from Africa, and she was an environmentalist. She started the Greenbelt movement, which focuses to plant trees, and now this movement is pretty much worldwide. But she passed away back in September, and she had been a very strong supporter of Forest Day and COPs, and so she was very much remembered on this event and throughout the conference. And then these pictures here on the bottom, this was another side event, again on protecting forests, and this was a very high-level event. Ban Ki-moon, the director for the Secretary General for the United Nations, was there. He gave a talk. Jane Goodall is the patron for this organization. And here you have Wangari Maathai, who's the daughter of Wangari Maathai, and she's kind of carrying the torch of her mother's legacy. So I was really quite honored to meet these very distinguished ladies. And then this picture up here, this was an event where they were recognizing this kid here in the middle. His name is Felix Finkelbauer. And what he has done is he started a movement similar to the Greenbelt movement. It's kind of been a spin-off of the Greenbelt movement, of children planting trees across the world. And his organization is called Plant a Tree for the Planet. So he has started these subsets of these organizations in many different countries, and so far he has planted, or his organization has planted, over 1 billion trees. So they were recognizing him at this event, and he's got the full support of the United Nations Environmental Program. This gentleman here, Ashim Steiner, is the director for the UNEP. And then the patron for his organization is the Prince Albert of Monaco. So he's really managed to have some very high visibility people to back his organization, and he's being very successful. I suspect we'll see much more of him in the future. Okay, so keeping on the topic of forests, there's a very strong initiative. It's called RED. So the idea, so RED stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. And the idea behind RED is to create a financial value of carbon stored in forests, offering incentives for developing countries to reduce emissions from forested land and invest in low carbon paths to sustainable development. So basically, forests would be worth more left as they are than cutting them down. That's the whole idea behind RED. And then the plus here has been added recently, and that stands for forest management. So this is really moving forward with a lot of force. there are a lot of issues yet to iron out with REDD, and one of them is called MRV, so it's measurement, reporting, and verification. This is something that's very difficult to do, to measure, report, and verify your carbon stocks and your forest and forest degradation for every nation, right? So you really need a standardized way of doing this, because nations are getting money, are receiving money for keeping their forests intact. And then here I include in asterisk the potential inclusion of agroforestry. As I mentioned earlier, the forest, I'll call them the forest people, they're very, very strong in this conference. Agriculture didn't have such a strong presence. However, one of the things that the agricultural people are trying to do is to include agriculture as part of REDD. And the reason for that is that many forests, or most forests, are cut down because of agriculture. And the idea here in including agroforestry is to have a sort of agriculture and forest. And this would bring great benefits because you have soils that are moister, you have more fertile soils, you've got more animals, and it's just a more vibrant environment. And not only that, but there's certain crops that grow better under the shadow. So this is something that is being carefully considered as part of REDD. Smart agriculture. So you do have conventional agriculture, and the push here in smart agriculture is to increase sustainable productivity and strengthen farmers' resilience, reduce agriculture's greenhouse gas emissions, and increase carbon sequestration. So the interesting thing about this effort and this initiative is that it develops agricultural practice that cover both adaptation and mitigation. Greenhouse gas emissions. This is a huge one, the greenhouse gas emissions, because all of the developed countries that ratified the Kyoto Protocol are binded to report their greenhouse gas emissions, and not only that, but to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 5.2% on average for the period of 2008 through 2012. And this reduction is relative to their annual emissions in a base year. So usually the base year was 1990. But when I talk about greenhouse gas emissions reduction, we're talking about the 4 major greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and sulfur hexafluoride. And then 2 groups of gases, the hydrofluorocarbons and the perfluorocarbons. So in terms of other issues related to climate change and earth science, there were issues on food security, that's a huge one, natural disasters, desertification, biodiversity loss, human health, and water security. And I leave water security in the end, but actually water is kind of an overarching issue in all of these, just because I think ultimately it's all about the water. You have too much water where you want it dry, and too little water where you want it wet. It's liquid where you want it solid. It's salty where you want it fresh. It's dirty where you want it clean. And ultimately, you can't grow food without water. So in terms of decisions and agreements that were reached from this, there were a couple of, some would say breakthroughs, others would be a little bit disappointed. But the way things played out, there should have been an agreement on Friday, and things just got extended. Discussions got extended, and agreements were reached on Sunday at 6 a.m. So that's why the decisions and agreements were reached at the 11th hour. So basically, there were the extension of the Kyoto Protocol for 5 to 7 years. So it wasn't scrubbed, but it was extended. And an adoption of a universal legal agreement on climate change by 2015. However, this new agreement will not be enforced until 2020. And that's a big thing. I mean, 2020 is a long ways away for issues that are so urgent. Then there's the establishment of a green climate fund, which will channel money to help developing countries with mitigation and adaptation strategies. And the kickstart for a host for the Climate Technology Center and Network to promote technology transfer between developed and developing countries. So that's just a major summary of what came out. In terms of strategizing for the future, I think there's several things that JPL can support in terms of earth science. One is RED. The other one is sea level rise projections at regional levels. The capability of climate change projections at national levels. I think one of the things that's really lacking is for countries to be able to project what the effects of climate change are going to be in the short, mid, and long range. And many countries now have these climate change commissions, but I think they're looking for scientific expertise to help them better assess what these projections are going to be. Disasters, all kinds of disasters, floods, droughts, extreme events, heat waves, water availability, again, I think that's the big one, and greenhouse gas emissions monitoring. And I know that JPL currently has an effort for greenhouse gas emissions monitoring. And even though it's not included here, I think education is kind of a big one, and that's something that we can all be involved with, because you go to these meetings and it's the policymakers that are up there making these decisions, and a lot of times I get the impression that they're ill-informed. So whatever, I think, contribution we can have in educating the public with regards to the science that we do can really, really go a long way. I did write a blog. I invite you to visit my blog, and it'll have kind of a more detailed narrative of my day-to-day experiences at COP17. You can access the blog through the climatesciences.jpl.nasa.gov website. And finally, before I conclude, I'd just like to bring the story of the rhino and the future of the rhino and the future of the UNFCCC. So the rhino is an endangered animal, and in South Africa, there are very few of them left in the wild. In fact, most of them are living in these reserves, these protected reserves. But their horn is very valuable because of its perceived health benefits. So the rhino is being killed for its horn, and poachers have found very sophisticated ways to get to rhinos. They'll go into these protected reserves at night with helicopters and thermal imaging equipment and put in guns and tranquilizers, and they'll hunt down these wonderful animals and kill them just for their horn. Gram for gram, the horn is more valuable than gold. So I'm afraid that the economic value of the rhino will lead to its demise, and the measures that are there to protect it will not be enough. So I just hope that the future of the UNFCCC is not on the same path as the future of the rhino. So finally, I leave you with a nice shot. This is beachside Durban. It's a very beautiful city. I'd like to thank a couple of people here at JPL. Dwayne Walliser for making it possible for me to go. Riley Duran, great advice. Thank you very much. Tony Freeman. And I'd like to thank Amber Jenkins for being really the magician behind my blog. And thank you for coming. And I'm open to questions.
Were there any discussions of population growth?
Actually, that is a great question. I didn't come across any discussion on population growth. And I think the reason for that is because it's a bit of a touchy subject. In fact, the role of women in combating climate change was already a touchy subject, and especially something that was being discussed at the US Center. So the focus was more on, oh my gosh, how do we feed all of these people and this growing population, rather than population growth.
First, I want to thank you for the particular emphasis on all of the topics that were involved at this complex conference that we didn't read about in the press here. And the note that we all should take away from that is that frequently when you go to these large international conferences, there's more progress made in the side meetings and in the discussions people to people directly than happened at the top level. And I really appreciate you calling to my attention the large, diverse number of topics that were actually touched on and how progress gets made without necessarily going through the top of the delegation and advancements can get made. I followed the conference very closely, as I'm sure everyone else in this room did, and as best we could in the U.S. press, and particularly the disappointment that developed toward Friday afternoon, and then the excitement, but the perception that was widely reported in the press that what happened on Sunday was a cosmetic benefit and a fig leaf covering up the fact that really very little progress had been made. The significant problem that I believe we all understand has plagued all these conferences has to do with carbon production in two large industrial countries, the United States and China, each which argues a different historical background justifies it to be able to continue doing it its way. Did you detect any progress that could be made by either side addressing that issue? China arguing that its historic development perhaps justifies a larger production of carbon than does ours, and the other issue about production of carbon on a per capita basis. Was there any motion in this?
There may have been, but not that I was aware of. Again, as I mentioned, I spent most of my time at the U.S. Center, and that wasn't what was touched in the discussions that were going on there.
So a week or two before this conference, the IEA came out with their annual World Energy Outlook, where their big finding was they project by 2017 the world will be locked into 2 degrees C mean temperature rise, primarily because the inertia in the global energy system is it's too hard to steer the ship quickly. So I'm wondering if that got any attention in any of the plenary discussions, and you made a comment about mitigation and adaptation being addressed together. Build on what Bob said, there's really 7 to 9 countries, depending on how you count them, that are the big drivers for the carbon emissions and the acceleration. And so addressing that tipping point and that steering problem, I'm wondering if there was any discussion about maybe a two-pronged approach, one where the UNFCCC perhaps shifts focus to working on adaptation because everyone's going to be impacted, including the sustainability issues you mentioned, but there really needs to be a tiger team, or really, if you will, a subset focused on those 7 to 9 big drivers to stop us from incurring even a greater increase. Was there any discussion about another structure or a sub-focus within the UNFCCC?
Well, the discussion on the new protocol that's going to be set is still TBD, but it may address the issues that you just talked about. And of course, that is the main problem, that most of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from just a handful of countries.
I was at the World Climate Conference a couple of years ago, and at that time, a big push from the science community was on climate services. And there was a big move that meteorological offices in various countries would start taking on that role. Was there much discussion about that? Even in the U.S. Center, I'm curious about whether NOAA was sort of pushing that idea and if there was any resonance to it.
I didn't hear any discussion about that, but there was discussion on setting a green fund and setting up a technology center. So the idea behind those is to channel money to developing countries for mitigation and adaptation strategies. And the technology center would offer advice to these developing countries on what's the best technology and what's the best in-country setup for not only adaptation and mitigations, but for monitoring the greenhouse gas emissions and resources within the country.
Most of our attention is focused on the carbon emissions, and obviously you listed the other serious greenhouse gases. Is there any significant likelihood that, say, for example, methane can be reduced more easily than carbon? Is there much discussion on that?
There wasn't much discussion on that, but it has been on the news recently. And I think more and more there is a focus on, in the short term, trying to control methane emissions.
And just a comment, the U.S. State Department just had a big announcement last week. There's a new initiative under the UN environmental program, UNEP, which focuses on short-lived greenhouse gases, methane, which is a carbon gas, and black carbon and soot and other short-lived climate forcings because of A, they're perhaps lower-hanging fruit. They don't involve tweaking the entire global energy system. And B, it's important to note that methane and some of these gases have much shorter time horizon climate forcing. Their impacts will be felt in 20 to 30 years, not over the next 100 years. So the Clinton Foundation and the World Bank are pressing for billions of dollars a year to address methane in particular and soot, particularly in the developing countries where most of the energy use, in particular for cooking and home use, is from biofuel burning, wood burning. So it's not just CO2, it's not just methane, it's the soot and black carbon and carbon monoxide and other short-lived forcing. So yes, then those programs perhaps have a more potential for near-term action. It's actually pretty hopeful.
Any other question?
Thank you. Erika, was there any discussion of the so-called tipping point events, like, with a temperature rise, you get suddenly the evaporation of like all these methyl calthates, or the loss of ice coverage reduces or increases or decreases your albedo to a point where you get these accelerated runaways, that these things may be in the very near term?
There were no discussions on tipping point other than Admiral Titley mentioning it in one of his talks. And he did stress the urgency in trying to get something in place sooner rather than later, just because we don't really know where the tipping points, when the tipping points will be occurring.
Erika?
Okay.
Great presentation, enjoyed it very much. I noticed you ended with some suggestions for JPL action. And I know that you've also have presented this briefly to, I believe, the Executive Council or something. Do you know if JPL is in fact acting on any of this, especially in light of the recently released presidential budget, in which one of the few things that still has money in it is earth science?
Right. Well, JPL is supporting the carbon monitoring system. The focus of that is to monitor greenhouse gas emissions. It's got a couple of proposals coming out. And in terms of RED, yes, JPL has a great interest in RED through its Destiny mission. So there's been quite a bit of work done already to show how remote sensing, LiDAR, and radar can support the RED initiative. Sea level rise and projections on climate change is still something that JPL is working on, but I think that's a direction that it's going into. And recently, JPL had a workshop with the UK Meteorological Office in looking how we could forge collaborations, not only with the UK Met Office, but with the University of Texas in supporting these projections in the short, mid, and long range, and how they could use some of our satellite products in their models.
Mind joining me in thanking Erika for her presentation?
Oh, one more thing. I brought a bunch of material here from the conference, so you're welcome to come up and take a look and borrow some of the material if it's of interest to you.